The time is now 5:33. Good evening and welcome to the May 29th, 2025 Prince George's County Board of Education meeting. I'm Brandon Jackson, Chairman. To hear the meeting interpreted live in Spanish, please call 508-924-5155. Again, the number is 508-924-5155. For those who are unable to attend in person, the meeting is being recorded and can be accessed through PGCPS YouTube channel for later viewing. Lastly, for recording purposes, the chairman reminds all board members to ensure that their microphones are turned on when speaking. We're going to move to the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Ms. Lopez, please call the roll.
Dr. Anderful,
Present.
Ms. Busser-Strother,
Present.
Mr. Briggs,
Present.
Ms. Goins-McCants,
Present.
Ms. Brown, Mr. Jungo, Dr. Moss,
Present.
Mrs. Olivo,
Present.
Ms. Walker, Mr. Jackson.
Here.
There are 7 board members present.
If there is no objection, the May 29th, 2025 meeting agenda will be adopted. There being no objection, the May 29th, 2025 meeting agenda is adopted. Public comment. The chairman recognizes registered speakers for their public comments. Public comments to our registered speakers have 3 minutes to make your presentations and may not relinquish any part of your speaking time. The board will recognize your comments but will not address them. Speakers may not address individuals or issues with profanity or derogatory terms. You will be warned once. If you continue, your comments will be muted and you may be removed from the meeting. Speakers are encouraged to use titles rather than names. For example, chair, board member, superintendent, principal, etc. There are 5 live public commenters tonight. Our first speaker is Ms. Alicia Baines.
So this is really concerning because the person that called me told me that this was a Q&A and that I would not have 3 minutes to speak, that I would only be allowed to ask 1 question. So I'm going to need a minute to pull up my notes that I had for me to speak. So if you can defer to someone else and then I can pull up my 3 minutes. That makes sense?
We can call you back up. We can call you back up. No problem. So the next speaker that we have is Ms. Shannon Reed. Okay, follow Ms. Shannon Reed, I have John Pham. Jason Graves. Lisa Wilson.
Good evening. My name is Lisa Wilson, and I'm here today injured with stitches in my leg because I believe it's very important that parents come out and stand up and speak truth to power. I am here to represent and stand up for the nearly 17,000 disabled students in PG County. I am an autism mom, and I'm here to plead with you, Board, based on Policy 8265, which is the board policy governing the evaluation of the superintendent. I am asking you to take a deep look into the special education program, and not just the program, but the complaints, the availability of services, and the letters that are going out to the parents telling them that their children cannot have a direct support aide, they cannot have speech therapy, and they can't have other related services because of shortages. Because while we understand this is a nationwide issue, we also need to really focus on the leadership part of this. This is a leadership issue. And so I ask you to juxtapose the nearly $400,000 salary for our superintendent against the disabled children who are told that they can't have speech therapy. We understand that speech is a part of communication. If we want our children to learn, we do have to make sure that they have the correct tools, resources, and access to services to help them to learn how to communicate. So in looking at the policy, it talks about PowerPoints and under Section 3A under artifacts. So I want you to reflect back on that PowerPoint presentation that was put on by the Special Education Department. First of all, I believe that we need an external audit. I do understand that the board has an auditing. We have all these other internal auditors. I think we need an external audit so we can get an independent voice to really get a true assessment of the special education program. Because when we police ourselves, we tend to only be a little favorable to ourselves. And I think in the reality, we need to think about the children that are not getting the services. And so I recall there was a certain amount of complaints, and then they mentioned one parent filed 11 complaints, which was highly offensive because that tells me that if one parent filed 11 complaints, something is truly wrong with that family. But every complaint represents a child. So even though it may be 30, 40, or 50, that's a child. And we need to look at it through that lens. And then it talks about stakeholders. Parents are stakeholders, and we need to be brought into the process as stated in the Andrews Supreme Court decision of 2017. And then it talks about reliable data that the board should be relying on. That goes back to that independent audit. What I believe is that we need to find true leadership for this school district that can understand the intersectionality of IDEA, Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, and Title II of the American Disabilities with Disabilities Act. There's nearly 17,000 children that need you to really think about your evaluation that will be taking place within the next 30 days. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ms. Banks?
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So good evening. My name is Alicia Renee, and I'm a parent and an advocate who has spent years fighting for my child's rights, and I'm beyond tired. You guys have seen my emails. I'm tired of the delays. I'm tired of the apologies, which I really haven't gotten. I'm tired of a system that continues to violate federal law year after year while children like mine fall further behind. My child has gone 2 full school years without a behavioral intervention plan, despite having one in place when he left elementary school. He went a full school year without speech-language services, even though they were on his IEP. And still, there has been no meaningful action to make up for the missed services. That is not a remedy. That is a denial of education. So let's be clear. Compensatory education is not optional. It is not a favor. It is a federally required remedy under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act when a school fails to provide FAPE. And it is not reasonable to delay services months or years after the harm has occurred. When schools delay compensatory education, they increase harm, then widen the learning gap. They leave parents scrambling, and they force kids to carry the consequences of adult failure. I've been told to wait, to be patient, to understand how hard it is to coordinate services, but what about how hard it is for a child to keep showing up without the support they need? This isn't my story. This is happening to families across this district. So tonight, I'm asking the board again, this leadership team again, Where is the urgency when it comes to making these children whole? Where is the tracking, the timelines, the transparency? Who is responsible for making sure compensatory services are actually delivered, not just discussed? Our kids don't get to repeat these years. They don't get refunds on missed services. They need solutions, not stale tactics. I urge you to prioritize compensatory education with the seriousness it deserves because the law demands it. And our children cannot wait any longer. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to circle back to make sure that we have more people coming in the room, that Jason Grievez, sorry if I pronounced the name wrong, or Shannon Reed, John Pham, that any of those people come into the room. Okay, moving along. I want to take a moment for executive privilege to acknowledge somebody for their hard work. I am delighted to officially congratulate board member Pamela Boozer Struthers on the recipient of the Maryland Association of Board of Education's for Distinguished School Board Member Award for 2025. Please join me in congratulating her. I don't want to put you on the spot, but did you want to have a few comments about it or to speak on it? Or?
All right, so I'll give a few words. Well, first, this is quite an honor to receive this award from the Maryland Association of Boards of Education, which includes all of the board members who serve in all 24 districts in the state, and I've had the privilege of getting to know them over the last nearly 7 years of my service. But I want to thank Chair Jackson for his nomination and everyone who supported him sending in the nomination. It is to be recognized by your peers is always deeply moving and lets you know how these years of hard work have had an impact and appreciated, and through all the tough times and all the incredible times like our graduation ceremonies. We've been privileged to stand on those stages this week. So I just, I'll have more to say in October, but when I did see the email as I was sitting in the Xfinity Center parking lot after the High Point High School ceremony, and for all the joy and tears of joy one feels when they're in ceremonies, then to sit in my car and to read that they all started over again. And I just want to say to serve the children of Prince George's County is an incredible privilege. I never take it lightly, and I will continue to fight every day until the end of my service term. So thank you.
Thank you. So moving forward to presentations 5.9, the chairman recognizes Superintendent House for the Blueprint Formula School-Based Funding presentation.
Thank you, Chair Jackson, and good evening, board members. Good evening, members of the community as well. Tonight's meeting is focused on something that's critical to our shared mission, which is, quite frankly, a clearer understanding of how we fund our schools through what's known as the per pupil allotment. You'll hear it referred to as PPA this evening. Now, as we work to implement the Maryland Blueprint, our goal remains, quite frankly, the same, which is ensuring that every student in the county has everything that they need, regardless of whether they're in a traditional district school, a charter school. The idea is that they have the equitable access and the resources they need to be able to thrive. Now, we recognize that the funding distribution is not just a matter of numbers, quite frankly. It's deeply personal, and it affects classrooms, it affects services, it affects, importantly, student outcomes when it's all said and done. Transparency and community understanding are essential. And again, that's why we're here this evening, is to ensure that we share what that understanding should look like. This year has brought unique financial challenges across the state, including a significant reduction in Title I funds and changing demographics and enrollment patterns in many schools, factors that weigh heavily on the new Blueprint funding formula. So I challenge everyone here to really put on their understanding hat, because one of the things that goes into this funding formula is the type of student that you have. And you'll hear that here in just a little bit in reference to the presentation. Now this year, this is also the first year that we are legally required to implement the Blueprints funding model. Now this is a major shift from how we've previously funded schools in the state of Maryland. Tonight, we'll walk you through how exactly the per pupil allotment is determined under the Maryland Blueprint, how it applies across different types of schools, and what it means for our system moving forward in the future. To begin it, I'd like to turn things over to our Chief Financial Officer, Lisa Howell, who she'll provide the opportunity on the screen to guide us through the funding formula and the critical role student demographics play. And I repeat that, the critical role that demographics play in shaping every school's budget. Ms. Howell?
All right, good evening, everyone. I have here with me today Mrs. Siobhan Smith. She is the budget director, and we will walk you through, at a very high level, the world that we've been living in for the last year and a half or so as we've been preparing for this implementation. We'll spend some time initially in the beginning just going over the fundamentals of Blueprint and kind of the building blocks that supports the funding methodology, as well as what ultimately feeds into the development of our school budgets. So we'll talk about the basics, we'll get into Blueprint revenue, and then we'll get into the school budgets, which consist of a few different components. So with that being said, without further ado, I appreciate this opportunity, and hopefully we'll come out of it on the other side with a greater collective understanding of the way in which this works. So I will turn it over to Siobhan.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit through our Blueprint fundamentals, starting with how funding is allocated, reported, and our accountability process. So the Maryland State Department of Education, they send funds down to the LEAs, and that funding is based on wealth equalization. There's certain formulas that drive our funding, and it's due to enrollment. So there are several Blueprint programs that affect our K through 12 students as well as our pre-K students. Our counties, they do contribute, similarly to the state, the local share. So for Prince George's County, they have a minimum funding that they have to provide us in their local share. They have to continue to meet the maintenance of effort, or MOE, and then pay the higher of the two calculations. So for Prince George's County, we receive a local share, okay? But then, once we get our funding based on Blueprint, we then now have to allocate that funding down to our schools. And that funding is, as Superintendent House stated, it's based on demographics. And then we'll talk a little bit about the reporting that we have to do back to the MSDE as well as the Accountability and Implementation Board, AIB. Okay, so I know this is a little hard to see, or at least it is for me, but just bear with me. Basically, these are our major funding categories for Blueprint. And I want to call your attention primarily to that first box, which says Foundation/Comparable Wage Index. That is our base funding. We receive funding for every eligible student. Eligible is the key word. And that base funding or foundation funding should be enough. If a school does not have students with specific demographics, that should still be enough funding to cover the basic needs of a school. So with that said, this just outlines some of the things that that funding can provide. So for example, for foundation, our instructional salaries, our teachers, we have student services, building operations, that's very important, special education, and that is specifically after the special education funding stream is exhausted. And I will just note that it is well known that we far exceed in expenditures for our special education and transportation than any revenue that is provided to us. So we have a lot of sped overage is what we call it, as well as transportation overage. But once we have met the special education funding stream, then we are able to use foundation funding as well as compensatory education and our multilingual learner funding streams to cover our special education costs. Thank you. Okay, so I just want to call attention to some of the other Blueprint programs that we have. These programs are restricted in nature, which means that they're very specific use for these fundings. That includes our concentration of poverty. There's 2 grants, personnel and per pupil. We have our transitional supplemental instruction, or TSI. And that is really additional support for our struggling learners. We have college and career readiness, and that is our funding for post-CCR, or college and career readiness pathways. And there's CCR standards that our children have to meet. We have our career ladder, and that, of course, is the funding for our nationally board certified teachers. And then the Blueprint coordinator, we do receive funding to partially cover the cost of our coordinator. And now I'm going to just walk you through the minimum school funding. So as you can see in that first row or first column, 75% of the per pupil amount for those 5 programs must be allocated to the school. That is law. Same on the restricted side, 75% of TSI and college and career readiness must be allocated directly to the school. And then 100% of our revenue for pre-K private providers and our concentration of poverty must be allocated down to the school. So I just want to make sure that you are aware of how the funding flows in and out of Prince George's County Public Schools. This is just a quick slide to outline the governance and the accountability part. So we mentioned the AIB. The AIB, along with the Maryland State Department of Education, there are reporting requirements that we must meet. There is a new financial reporting system called PowerSchools. We have to upload financial information into that on a monthly basis. FY25 is our base year. FY26, we are required to exceed that base year by 50%, with the expectation by the time we get to FY27, we are 100% compliant with the Blueprint requirements. There is an opportunity for a waiver. We are working through that now. We have not yet completed FY25, so once we get that baseline, we can then figure out where we need to go. But we will complete a waiver that will help buy us some time, because there are some decisions that will need to be made and reviews that will have to be had before we can say we absolutely are sure we can meet that requirement by FY27. And then just to outline, when we say minimum school funding, or MSF, that percentage, that the calculation is our total school budget divided by the Blueprint revenue. That gives us our minimum school funding percentage. There are a lot of valued services that Prince George's County Public Schools provides. However, in those valued services, they are outside of our Blueprint requirements. We receive funding, again, based off of the demographics of our eligible students. But Blueprint does not take into consideration class size. It doesn't take into consideration our small schools that still will need certain base level things in order to function. It doesn't take into consideration the safety and security needed at our schools. It doesn't take into consideration our much valued specialty programs that many of our schools provide. It doesn't take into consideration our art and music programs or world languages, athletics, extracurricular activities. All of these things have to be funded. We are having to use our blueprint revenue to fund those things, and that does impact our funding formulas when we are trying to meet minimum school funding requirements. I'm going to turn it back over to Chief Howell.
All right. Thank you for that initial overview. So now we'll spend some time talking about the building blocks that goes into the revenue, the blueprint revenue specifically, as well as how we go about developing our budgets. So first off, I want to draw your attention to the demographic information on the left-hand side around enrollment. This is important. You look to see that we are funded at a certain level for 2026, as an example, of 125,706 students. You can see our projected enrollment is 127,157 students. I want to point out the fact that we are funded a year in arrears. So even though it says 56 fiscal year 26 K through 12 funded, that's based off of last year's, meaning this current school year, 9/30/2024, actual enrollment. So that determines the funding that we get for the next year. So you can see there's a gap between the students we're expecting to show up next year versus the funding that we got to educate those students for next year. So there's already a difference that we have to balance to make sure that we are building a budget to support the students we expect to show up. We then have our projected as well as our funded amounts for pre-K as well. And again, you see a delta between what's projected versus the funding that we received for this year. I do want to point out that for pre-K, we don't receive funding for all of our pre-K students. It is income eligible. So depending on federal poverty level thresholds, it's outlined in the legislation, there's different criteria that defines those that fall within Tier 1 and Tier 2, and we receive a different amount depending on which tier those students are in. They must be full day, not half day, they must be full time, and if they meet those income eligibility criteria, we receive funding from them. If they don't, we don't receive funding. So that's the enrollment. I want to skip over now to the middle box that outlines student population. And this is really important because this is the fundamentals of how the blueprint works. So as Ms. Smith outlined before, while we have all these great programs that we do offer within the school system, the methodology to fund those programs is tied to demographics. It's not tied to our offerings, so we have to balance the two. So our student population, as you see for the whole district, we have about 65% of our student population are free and reduced meals. Multilingual learners, 26%, and student with disabilities, 12%, pre-K, 4%. So we receive base funding, as she indicated, foundation for every single student, and then we receive additional funding based off of these demographics. For charters, on the far right-hand side, the demographics are different. Out of our 10 charter schools that we have, which makes up about 5% of our total population, free and reduced price meals is 44%, multilingual learners are 3%, and student with disabilities are 8%. So again, that's going to drive the funding that goes to the schools. And this is an aggregate, so it looks very different from school to school. So even within a school type, or even within a school, per pupil, that amount can look very different. We'll talk about that in a moment. When you look at the two little boxes with the schoolhouses on them, the way that we think about our school population, we're developing budgets for all of our schools. We break them into two buckets, non-SBB. SBB stands for student-based budgeting. So non-SBB schools versus SBB schools. The primary difference is that our non-SBB schools, the staffing, the programming, what's needed for those schools is determined by and managed centrally, and those resource allocations are made and those budgets are developed and centrally managed, primarily by the academics team as well as school support and leadership. And then on the SBB schools, those budgets are developed and managed, resource allocation decisions made primarily by the principals. So that's how we sort of think about the universe of our school budgets, of our school types. So this slide here highlights at a very high level our blueprint revenue categories for traditionals in black and for charters in blue. And what this demonstrates is that out of the total 100% of the blueprint revenue we get for these major programs, for our traditional schools, 50% of that comes from foundation. And again, we get that for every student. And then on top of that, we have additional revenue that's stacked for compensatory education, which is our farm students, another 14% for ML, special ed, et cetera, pre-K. For charters, their demographics looks different. A fair amount, the majority of their funding comes from foundation only, and then they receive another out of the 25% of their student population, on top of that, compensatory education. They have a smaller population of ML, which results in less revenue, and then special education is 5%, and then they don't have pre-K students. So it's a very different type of revenue distribution between our traditional and charter schools because of the demographics of those schools. And then again, out of all the funding that's generated, at least 75% needs to follow the student to the school. So let's take a closer look at the per pupil amounts, or the PPAs. You see on the far left-hand side are the major blueprint categories. And we have a hypothetical example here, 4 different columns. I'll focus on the first 3 right now. So let's say it's imaginary school in Prince George's County, elementary school. You've got 3 different students in that school. The student C, that individual, has their multilingual learner, compensatory education, and they also have disability. So in addition to the base funding that they get, which is foundation, as well as comparable wage index, their total per pupil amount for student C is over $36,000. Next to that, you can have a student B that doesn't have any of those additional demographic categories. Their funding is only $9,722. And then student A is somewhere in the middle. They've got a little bit of, they've got multilingual and comp ed, but not student with disability. So that's within one school where you can have a per pupil amount that looks very different depending on the students in those schools. I do want to highlight that for foundation, there is a portion of that that's outlined in legislation that's set aside for career counseling. Those funds are sent directly out the door to our workforce development partners. So that fund does not stay with us, so that's backed out from the foundation amount that's outlined in legislation. And in the far right-hand column next to student C, you've got pre-K student. We don't receive all those additional funding categories, but we do receive, in this example, it's pre-K tier 1. We receive around a little bit over $14,000 for that student. If it's tier 2, the amount is around $13,400 or so. It's roughly there in that ballpark. So if this is imaginary school in Prince George's County Elementary School, and I have 4 students, my total revenue that's being generated by my school is around $86,000. Now, 75% of that at least needs to come to my school, but in total, that's the revenue that comes to the district for the school based off of the student demographics. On average, this is what it looks like by our high-level buckets that we have between elementary, all of our traditional schools, our alternative schools, SPED regionals, and charters. And you can see the PPA amounts. They really vary depending on school type, but this is really driven by, ultimately, underneath the actual individual students within each of those schools. So it can range as high as, almost, on average, in the far right-hand column for our SPED regionals, almost close to $25,000. And it can be, as low as $14,000 as you see for the charters. And again, that's based off of the demographics. One thing that I want to definitely highlight here for SPED regionals as an example is the fact that we have the cost of delivering those special education services far exceed the revenue that we get. So that impacts that per pupil amount that you see, but that number is high because you may have a student that's getting foundation, they're getting comparable wage index, they're getting ML, comp ed, and they're getting student with disability. Not every single student is necessarily going to have that high of a mark, but with SPED regionals, they service students with disabilities, all of them. So you're going to have that kind of a makeup at that high end. But this just really, again, it all comes back to the demographics of the students in the schools. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about minimum school funding versus commensurate funding, and this is really the basis for how we think about the budgeting for our charters. So Education Article 524, 5234, which we've been discussing, is really around each school receiving the funding that's mandated in the blueprint. 75% of that is going to the schools. So that all applies to the charters. In addition to that, we've got commensurate funding, or CF, on the right-hand side that talks about the funding from other sources as well, federal, state, and county, that should also be considered as part of the funding that is allocated to our charter schools. So really the goal is that there's a harmony of these two legislations that supports the budgeting that is the basis for a charter school, that they should exist in harmony. And so we'll walk through this in a little bit more detail of what that looks like. The other thing that I wanted to highlight relating to the calculation for charters as a whole is that there are some allowable exclusions on a countywide basis that can be backed out from the revenue between MSF and CF, and that includes countywide obligations, contracts for certain goods or services. I'll give an example for us. It's other post-employment benefits, which is a funding liability that we have to make for our retirees. It's not broken down, it's for the whole district, so that would potentially be something we would back out of the allocation before it's distributed to the charters. For 2026, there's actually another exclusion as well. So debt service has always been something that's been allowable as a deduction. In 26, there's also this concept of sped overage, which Ms. Smith spoke of earlier, and we'll get into the calculation what that looks like. And then there is the opportunity, as we're looking at centralized services, to negotiate those and good services and what that looks like. And this is still sort of a gray area that I will certainly kind of highlight here at this point. This is something that's really important on both, for all parties involved to go through this process, but to make sure that whatever is required by COMAR, that we're following those requirements. So let's talk a little bit more about the first piece of the funding, commensurate funding that is allocated to charters. On the far left-hand side, you'll see all the various blueprint programs, as well as transportation, which is the last bullet there, excluding special education. That funding is distributed to the charters, based off of the legislation that's outlined. For the middle column, what's not dispersed directly to charters includes, number one, the funding for special education, and those services are provided to charters on their behalf by PGCPS. And so we do allocate and capture the budget and the expenses for special education in the cost centers for charters, but it's not distributed as cash, and those services are provided for those students. In addition to that, there's some other ancillary revenues that the district brings in as well, interest income, transition grant, and federal impact aid. And those additional resources, it's not a lot relative to our total budget, but those additional resources goes towards covering our sped overage, and we'll talk about that in a little bit further. So that's not distributed and assigned to any of our schools, including our charters. And then on the far right-hand side are just those other revenue streams that we have as a district that are not considered or applicable for charter schools, such as pre-K. As I mentioned earlier, they don't have pre-K students. Our non-public placement revenue that we receive for our special education students. And you can read the list here. I'm not going to go through it in detail. I do want to highlight that fund balance, even though it's listed, it's not really a revenue source. It is a stopgap measure that if you have a difference between your revenue and your expenses in any given year, you may need to plug in your fund balance to close the difference, but your recurring revenue does not include revenue from the fund balance. Now we get into our restricted revenue sources and what's allocated to charters. So while the ESSER funds are expiring, that has been a huge infusion of funding that we've all had the benefit of over the last few years. Title I, we have one Title I school this school year, 2024-25. Next year, that we won't have any Title I charter schools. And then concentration of poverty, and those funds are allocated to the schools, to the charters. We then have our centrally managed funding, and the majority of this funding is not allocated, well, all of this funding is managed centrally. It's not allocated to any of our schools. I will make a key point is that for fiscal year 26, a lot of this funding is going to be going away from what we understand. We're still waiting, obviously, on the federal government to finalize their bill, but we've already heard about Title II, Title III, so a lot of that is going to potentially be going away for next year. But all of those grants are managed centrally to benefit either our educators, whether it's Title II as an example, our staff development grant, that's available for all of our educators, those that are working at charters as well as traditionals. And then we have supports under Title III and Title IV that's afforded to all of our students. And then we have the TSI and the other grants that you see listed there. And then we have a few other grants on the side that don't apply to charters. So now we will transition into the next phase of our conversation as we talk about the development of our school budgets. So this is really important to kind of understand because we often hear a discussion around what's allocated to the schools. And so when you think about our traditional schools and our charter schools, the components that make up a total school budget are very similar. It starts off with the allocation. On the traditional side, we refer to that as our SBB allocation, student-based budgeting allocation. And again, that's the piece that the principal has the discretion to make those resource allocation decisions to build their own budget. On the charter side, that allocation is what is dispersed to the charters, and the principals, in collaboration with the charter operators, they develop the budgets for the charter schools. So out of the total budget for both of the school types, 40% on the traditional side is from the SBB portion, and 89% is from the charter portion. The next section are our school-based locked resources, and what those are, essentially, those are school-based positions and resources. They're at a school level. However, the resource allocation decisions are managed centrally, but they are all school-based positions. For charters, that only includes the special education positions. They don't have any other locked resources. For non-charters, it's various other types of positions and resources. And then the third and final bucket are those that are centrally managed. And those include, again, school-based activities, school-based resources and supports directly in support of students and schools. Those resource allocation decisions are managed centrally as well, but they're in a central office cost center. So that's the difference. It's not sitting in a school cost center initially, but ultimately the goal, part of Blueprint, are to get those costs into a school cost center. So those three buckets between allocation, locked, and centrally managed makes up the entirety of a school's budget. And you can see, again, it looks different between traditionals and charters.
Thank you, Chief Howell. Okay, so now Chief Howell already kind of walked you through a school-based locked, but I'm just going to I'm going to go in a little bit more detail. So in this case, when you have a school-based locked position, those are predetermined positions that are allocated to our schools, which means they go into our school's cost center. However, that resource allocation decision is managed centrally. So our central office experts, they make the decision of what that needs to be. For our charters, special education is the only locked resource that apply. And as you can see the list over there to the right that kind of walks through for our traditional schools some of the other instances of a school-based locked, whether it be a position or some of the discretionary resources. The tricky part is when we talk about the centrally managed locked. They are also predetermined. However, they are not pushed down to a school's cost center. They are managed at the central office cost center. And as Chief Howell mentioned, our goal is to get them out of the central office cost center, both the budget and the actual expenditures, and into the school's cost center. But for right now, how it's defined, it stays within our central office's cost center. For our charters, you can see those listed in blue. For FY26, for this upcoming school year, we did not withhold funding from our charters for these services. However, we are still going to provide those services to our charter schools. We will still continue from an IT perspective to support our employees and make sure that our students have the services that they need. And then just another emphasis, even though it has been said, our special education services are provided on behalf of charters. So even though the revenues are not dispersed to the charters, the services are provided, and so we do capture the budget and the expenditures at the charter school cost center.
So now I want to talk a little bit about the actual charter school allocation formula and what that looks like. So we're going to start off with the allocation portion. Well, I said formula earlier. It is a formula, but I'm thinking about the total budget for the charter school. But the first component of that, which I spoke of earlier, is the allocation piece, and this is what is defined as being dispersed to the charters. So I want to sort of walk through what that actually looks like, and this is in aggregate for all of our charter schools. So it starts off with our blueprint funding that we discussed earlier. For foundation and CWI, it is based off of the per pupil amount for those two blueprint programs times the projected student count. So remember I stated earlier that we get funding based off of our 930 count for the previous year, but we have to make sure that we're staffing and providing resources for the year to come. So that revenue or that allocation is based off of what the projected student enrollment for the coming year. For ML Comp Ed, we obviously don't know what that demographic is going to look like for next year, so we do base it off of the 930 count that we received funding for. So for Foundation CWI, that's $69 million. ML and Comp Ed, that's an additional $26 million. And then we look at our total transportation that's provided to the district. We determine that on a per pupil basis, and the charter received their share of that revenue for the projected student count as well. That's an additional $3 million. Now, when we walk through the basics of the funding methodology earlier, we are allowed under the current guidance to exclude countywide obligations. This is an area that I think requires further clarity and definition from the state about what this looks like. Again, depending on, we've got 24 LEAs, we can all look at this and interpret it slightly different and what that means and how you define countywide obligations. So for 26, even for 25 for that matter, we did not back out our countywide obligations. So when you add up those three components, it gives you the total charter revenue of $98 million. You take the 2% admin fee, back that out, and these numbers are rounded, get you to a net charter allocation that is dispersed to the charters of $96 million. Now I want to continue on with the remainder of the charter school budget. So again, we've got the allocation amount of $96 million that the charters actually receive. But then on top of that, we do have the budget associated with providing services for students with disabilities, which we capture and record all that in the charter cost centers, and that's an additional $6 million. And then we have the centrally managed services as well that was spoke of earlier. That's another $5 million. So again, we did not withhold any funding, and we have yet to kind of delve into the negotiating of centralized services. So that's something that's still to be determined of what that might look like in future years. But for this year, that's just an additional $5 million in terms of the budget, but nothing was withheld from the charters. So overall, that then gets you to a total charter school budget of $107 million. When you consider all of the major programming, all of the major program revenues, that's a total of $101 million, and that includes transportation. When you back out transportation and you just look at blueprint revenue only, it drops down to $98 million relative to a blueprint budget of $104 million. So that gets you to, if you remember that formula that, I feel like I'm teaching a math class, the formula that we went through earlier where you take your total budget divided by your total revenue gets you to your MSF percentage. So the MSF percentage for charter schools is 107%. So that basically means the costs exceed the revenue that we get. I want to talk a little bit about the SPED overage. So this is new for 2026. Part of the guidance that we receive from the state is that this is a real obligation that is borne by the district, realizing that our SPED costs do exceed the revenue that we pull in. And this is not a dynamic that's unique to PGCPS. This is a phenomenon across the entire state. We have the highest SPED overage in the state, right behind Montgomery County. Obviously, they're the largest district, so their overage is even greater than ours. But all LEAs are experiencing the cost of providing these services relative to the funding that we receive from state and county. So all in, when you look at the formula on the right-hand side, there's a column that says total, and that includes our total revenue associated with students with disabilities. Not only is it the blueprint revenue at the top, we also receive revenue for non-public placements. Those are those funding that we receive for students with disabilities that are placed in non-public educational schools. And then we also have transportation associated with transporting students with disabilities as well. So on the total side, that gets you total revenue of $177 million. When you exclude those two buckets, as we did when we were calculating the sped overage for charters, we did not consider non-public or sped transportation. Again, this is another area that I think needs to be further defined by the state because it's interpreted differently depending on how each of the LEA looks at the guidance that we got. So this is another vague area, but we were conservative in calculating the sped overage, and we did not consider non-public and transportation. So continuing down with the calculation here, you've got your sped costs. That includes all of our costs providing services across the district. You layer in that non-public expenditures and the cost of transporting. The total budget, as you can see, is a little bit different if you're including it in aggregate or if you're backing it out for the calculation for charters. But that's another component that feeds into this calculation. So your total revenue minus your total expenses get you to your overage. So for the district as a whole, you can see we have a deficit or an overage of $265 million, which is staggering, but it's consistent with what we see across the state. If you exclude the non-public component and transportation, as I mentioned earlier, that sped overage is around $178 million, I'm rounding up. So when you consider that and you break it down on a per school basis, the charter's share of that $178 million is 3.5. If you then go back to that earlier slide where I had the unrestricted revenue and what's allocated to charters and what isn't, and I mentioned there's a few other categories, interest income, transition grant, and federal impact aid. So we calculated what that would be on aggregate and then divided that on a per school or per pupil basis to come up with their share of those additional revenue streams and compare that to the sped overage. That's $1.8 million, 1.9 if you round up. So the difference between the sped overage of 3.5 offset by the additional unrestricted revenue, that still leaves a shortfall of $1.6 million. According to the guidance that we received, that additional cost would be borne by the charters, but we're holding them harmless for 26, and that difference is not being assigned to charters. So I mentioned earlier a few different areas that I really feel strongly about, and I've been in lots of conversations with my colleagues across the state, that with all the guidance that we have received, some as most recent as today, there's still some uncertainty around how to understand and interpret what the allocation should look like as it relates to commensurate funding. And so the guidance that we did receive, which I've walked through already, that we really use as a foundation for our calculation, still leaves some areas that are gray. I mentioned earlier about non-public transportation. Should that be included in the sped overage calculation or should it not be? Some LEAs say it should. We took a conservative approach and we did not consider it. But it needs to be clarified, in my opinion. Also, how do we go about allocating the sped overage to the schools? Do we do it on a per pupil basis? Do we do it on a pro rata basis? That needs to be further defined if we want it to be consistent across the state. And then the way in which we calculate the sped cost, I think, generally speaking, most CFOs agree with how we kind of get to that number. There's a maintenance of effort calculation that we have to go through every year to certify our costs. So that is how we went through our calculation. And I think we all approached that piece in the same way. But again, it wasn't clarified or mentioned at all in the guidance that we've received up until this point. We want it to be black and white. So I think that's an area of clarification. Transportation overage, that was mentioned earlier as well. So just as we talked about there being a difference between the revenue we get for sped and the cost, same thing on the transportation side. Again, this is a phenomenon across the state. It's not us. So there is a difference between the revenue we get from the state and county to cover transportation and the actual cost to transport students. There is a difference. That difference, we eat that cost in our budget. So there's some consideration, well, should that be treated similar to how we account for the sped overage and backing that out because we have to cover that obligation, it's required. Centrally managed services, I think this is an area that requires more guidance around if it's a COMAR required mandate, is that something that you negotiate or is that something that's mandated that we have to make sure is being considered and how that's being developed and how that's being executed. District-wide obligations, I mentioned earlier about the OPEB. Teacher retirement is another example of that. Restricted federal programs, there's been some discussion around how that should really be occurring. And I mentioned earlier, a lot of our federal funding may be going away or may be reduced for next year. Debt service exclusions, this is another one where we took a relatively conservative approach around what that would look like for 26. So we did speak a little bit about part of our debt service, but we have P3, which is sort of unique to us. So I guess now we will transition quickly over to the traditional school allocation calculation.
So I'll go through these slides a little quick because Chief Howe did a good job walking through. It's not that different than what was already walked through for our charters. So for our traditional schools, once again, our foundation and comparable wage index, that revenue, you have your per pupil amount, and it's multiplied by your actual student count. And then we have our ML, Comp Ed, SPED, Pre-K, again, per pupil amount, multiplied by the actual student count. So for our traditional schools, the foundation and CWI revenue, that's $1.1 billion. And then for the ML, Comp Ed, SPED, Pre-K, that's $1.2 billion. So our total Blueprint major program revenue is $2.3 billion for our traditional schools. When we back out central office administration, which is about 13%, it's $300 million. That gives a net school allocation total of $2 billion, or 87% of our total revenue. And again, we must distribute at least 75% of the program revenue to each school. To further break down that $2 billion, so we already talked about, so our student-based budget allocation for our traditional schools is about $800 million. The school-based locked resources are $699 million, and then our centrally managed locked resources for our traditional schools are $522 million to give the total school allocation of $2 billion. And then this slide just kind of walks through the allocation development process. It starts with our FY25. So for this coming year, for FY26, it started with our FY25 student-based budget, which is a mouthful to say. But it also includes some salary adjustments. We know that salaries did not stay stagnant. People got raises and things of that nature, increases in FY25, so we need to make adjustments for them. In addition, at a point in time, our vacant positions, we calculate our average salaries and benefits, any changes to discretionary. That then gives us our FY26 base budget. You move over to enrollment change, plus or minus, and again, as mentioned earlier, we have projected enrollment versus actual enrollment. So even though we only get funded on actual enrollment as of 9/30/2024 for FY26, we have to plan for the projected enrollment that we receive from pupil accounting. In FY26, we decided that we were going to lock an assistant principal position. All schools must have one principal. Starting in FY26, all schools will also have a 12-month assistant principal. And so we needed to make an adjustment. We removed it from their SPB allocation if that position was purchased in FY25. And then finally, we have our minimum school funding allocation changes. And this is just where I want to emphasize that we being on the finance team, we created a model. However, it didn't stay there. So we collaborated and worked very, very closely with our principals, with our instructional directors, with our associate superintendents to make sure that schools were whole and that they could function properly in FY26. So even though this says, oh, we had to do a $19 million reduction across 93 schools to reallocate to other schools, we went school by school by school. And when I say we, it is the collective we. It is our associate superintendents, it is our instructional directors, it is our principals, wanting to make sure that schools had what they needed for the upcoming school year. And so there was not a single decision made by the finance team regarding the budget. If a principal said, I need, and it was approved by the instructional director and the associate superintendent, never once did anybody on the budget team or our chief financial officer deny that request. So where we landed looks very different than where we started with our school operating resources. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it back over to Chief Howe.
All right, so as we near the end of this, wanted to kind of get a high-level overview of the MSF percentages that we started with when we began this process. We don't have where it ended up because we just finished the budgets like a few days ago. But this is where we started. The goal was to get all of our schools to an MSF percentage of at least 72%. We have to be at 75 by the end of this third year implementation that we're going through. The goal was to get to 72. As we went through the reallocation process, we realized in some cases, maybe it's going to be 71, maybe it's going to be 70, because we had to make sure that we were sending the resources that needed them the most. We are considering the fact that Title I funds are being cut by 20%, and some of those resources are now being absorbed in the general fund budget. We're considering the fact that we've got CSI schools that need those additional resources, and this is not the year to pull back. And so we had to make those difficult resource reallocation decisions. So in some cases, those percentages came down for certain schools to fund what's needed for the schools that need those resources the most. At a high level, across all the different school types, you can see that the MSF percentage can range widely. Those that have a high concentration of students with disabilities are ECCs, sped regionals. I think we can understand, we've talked about that a lot already, what's driving those percentages to be so high. But there's also other, reasons behind why the numbers look the way that they look on an aggregate basis. Our smaller elementary schools, they're small. You need what you need in order to operate those schools. Those MSF percentages are going to be on the high end. We may have specialty schools. We have our Academy of Health Sciences. The funding for that is very different. The students are dual enrolled. The funding doesn't work the same way from the state. Those MSF percentages are high. But in aggregate, this is what it looks like when we started, and again, we tweaked it a little bit as we went along. The last and final slide, I see I'm running out of time, I want to be able to highlight this real quickly, is that as we are nearing the end of this cycle around implementation, and we still have a long ways to go, we are still facing a lot of challenges. Number one, we have to ensure that we are maintaining the academic programming that's needed in our schools. That's critical. And as we said in the beginning, the funding follows the student, but it doesn't always consider the programming and the needs of those schools, so it's balancing that out. Federal funding uncertainty. As I said, Title I, we planned for it to be cut. We don't even know what that's going to be for next year, but we had to make some decisions so we can complete our budgets. Resource limitations. This is a highly manual process, and we are navigating through this with an aging ERP, and there's a lot of accountability and reporting that's required. We don't have the infrastructure that's needed to report the information that's required for meeting blueprint compliance requirements, which is why we're looking to do a waiver, because we need more time. We have over $500 million in centrally managed costs that directly support schools. We want to get credit for that. We want to be able to tell our story. Right now, it's sitting in a central office cost center, but we have to figure out how to get it from there to the school, because that's what Blueprint requires. So it's challenges like that, and we have limitations with people, resources as well. Mapping, this is another accounting piece that's tied to the funding requirements for Blueprint. We have to map every single dollar. So you put aside the fact developing a budget is challenging enough. On top of that, we have to map every single position and every single budget dollar to one of our 5 Blueprint programs, not on just the budget side, but also on the actual expenditures. How do we do that? It's a highly manual process right now, extremely, extremely challenging. And then going through the waiver process, which is still evolving. We understand there's supposed to be more guidance coming out next week on what that's supposed to look like. So we'll be anxiously awaiting of how that's going to evolve, but that's going to be a labor-intensive process just to prepare the request for a waiver to allow more time. And then the guidance around this continues to evolve and change. We are building and flying the plane at the same time. MSD says go left, we switch gears and we have to go left. But it's a big ship to move from one direction to another. So that continues to be a challenge for us as we go through this process. Thank you for your time and your patience this evening, and we are here to receive any questions that you may have.
Chair Jackson, that concludes our presentation.
Thank you so much, Superintendent. Right now, I want to pause, and so we don't have our digital display, so I want to pause and see if we have any questions from school board members, and I guess we will have to raise our hand. Old school, raise your hand. So do we have any questions? Okay, I see, let's start with Dr. Moss.
Testing. One, I want to thank, where did she go? Oh, okay. I want to thank Chief Howell for her leadership and Ms. Bradley for their leadership on bringing this together. I do want to talk a little bit about where we are with teacher compensation. It's no secret I care deeply about it, having been a teacher, but it's also no secret that is an issue here and around the country. So, you know, one of the things that I did in my quick bit of research, the Economic Policy Center said the minimum wage in this area should be $64,242. In D.C., a teacher is paid a starting salary of $64,640. And Prince George's County Public Schools is $57,731. That is a difference of $6,000. Now, while I'm not shaming our leadership pay, MSDE also argued that we were number 2 in the state for leadership pay, and we're number 12 in the state for starting teacher salary. There's also a statutory requirement around the comparable wage index that essentially says statutorily that our salary should reflect the regional differences. We actually get an allocation to reflect those regional differences. So one of the questions that I have is, what are the what cost of living adjustments do we really need to make in order for us to be competitive and really reflect the highest cost of living? And you shared some of these different notions on slides 3, 12, 15, and 25. So the short end of my question is, how do we get teachers to at least the $64,640 that teachers and DCPS are making? We have some of the hugest educator shortages. So what do we need to do in terms of cost of living adjustments to be able to get us there? Do we need to go into the comparable wage index and increase that at the school level to get to that 75% minimum school funding? So Chief Howell, if you could speak a little bit about what do we need to do to really get us there, or what's keeping us from getting there? I know we've made some adjustments, but what do we need to do to get us there? I don't think that we can wait on that. You've all seen the TikTok video from the lady that came to our last school board meeting talking about leaving the system. So I think it's important to the public that we explain why we can't get our teachers to $64,242 that the Economic Policy Center says is the minimum wage.
And Chief Howell, I know you're itching to kind of share what that could potentially look like, but what I will say, Dr. Moss, is that being that we're in the midst of negotiations, I don't know that we can get into legally, get into the conversation around the how, the when, the what needs to happen. So definitely understand where you're coming from and understand where many others are coming from in reference to the livable wages to be able to live in this community. But as I stated on the front end, we are in the midst of negotiations with PGCEA.
Yeah, I fully understand. Is she going to answer the question a bit? I understand the context around it. I think my question is really grounded in what do we need to do to get there? I'm not talking about the negotiations. I know that that's not proper, but how do we actually get there?
So I will turn it over briefly to our budget director, but I do want to just highlight that as we've considered what's needed in order to ensure that our salaries are more competitive, we are taking that into consideration in the budgets that we have been developing. Again, we are still in active negotiations, and our goal is to be competitive as we're coming out on the other end of this process. And so it's not going to be, the school budgets that we've developed are not necessarily going to be changed or modified based off of what's coming out of the negotiation process, because we did make some assumptions going into the budget of what that will look like. And to the extent that we have to make adjustments, potentially slightly, once we settle all of our outstanding negotiated agreements, we will certainly do that. but I will turn it over to Director Smith. She is participating. She's one of the members that participates in the negotiations, meetings with PGCA and our other labor partners.
Thank you, Chief Howell. So, as was mentioned, we are in ongoing negotiations. As of Tuesday, we provided an economic package understanding, based on the superintendent's guidance, that we want to provide a comprehensive package that will help get our teachers to a salary sooner rather than later. So that comprehensive package is being mulled over by PGCEA, and next Tuesday, hopefully, or this coming Tuesday, we will see if they accept that package, but that will get them to where you were speaking about, Dr. Moss, come July 1, 2025.
All right, Board Member Jonko.
Okay. Thank you so much, Chair Jackson. First, I want to say thank you for the presentation. My question was more around, well, I don't have the exact slide number, but it's student counts and school types, where we talk about enrollment, where the projected student enrollment for FY26 from K to 12 is 127,157 students, and then, of course, the amount of students that were funded were only 125,706 students. And I think what I heard Chief Howell say was that that number came from the enrollment from September 30th, 2024. So of course, that's 10,000 students that don't have, that aren't fully funded, and that we have to pay out of our hands with our budget. So I'm trying to figure out, well, 10,451 to be exact, but is there a process that we can do to be able to give that number later on in the year, so that we're not having almost 10,000 students that aren't fully funded? Or even with the pre-K students, because of the fact that the only amount of students that were funded, the only students that were funded were about 3,839, and then, of course, projected was 5,522, which is about 36%. Is there a way we can give that number a little bit earlier on, so that later on, so instead of September, maybe kind of around, I guess you could say kind of around the legislative season, more closer to that, so that then we don't have that much of a gap to have to pay out of our budget, so that we can use it to reallocate it on other things in the county. I think that's I don't know if you can give me an answer on that, but that's something I just kind of seen interesting.
Thank you for that question, and I think I understand where you're coming from. I want to just kind of back up a little bit and explain the funding requirements based off of the state. So that deadline of September 30th is mandated by the state. And so in order for a student to be considered eligible, they need to be enrolled as of September 30th. They need to have attended school at least one day in the month of September, and they need to have their immunization documentation on file, whether it's an exemption from meeting that requirement or they've turned in their immunization forms. So those three items must be in place for the students to be counted. The way in which we could increase that funding is to increase the compliance with immunization. And there was actually an effort made this year because our district has a high level of newcomers that come into the county. They arrive in the month of September, and they don't have time to meet that requirement to have their paperwork in place. And so we did put forth, I know it was a huge agenda item for us this year, to have some consideration around those students being counted later on. But the way the legislation is written currently, if they don't meet those requirements by 9:30, we educate the students, but we don't receive the funding, and we just have to make it work with what we get. For pre-K students, this is actually defined in blueprint legislation as well. So the goal really is to be able to increase the number of students who are kindergarten ready, and we do that by providing pre-K free of charge to families for those who are income eligible. So it is not free pre-K for everyone. However, that doesn't mean that we don't have pre-K students who are here that we don't receive funding for. And so there's going to be a gap for pre-K because of the way the legislation is outlined and the programming that we have in place. So there's not much that we can do. Well, I don't want to say there's not much, but as a district, we've made the decision to make the investment in pre-K students for those that may or may not meet the income eligibility requirements. There is a component in legislation that allows to charge families who are not meeting the income eligibility requirements to pay for pre-K. But we've made that investment, we've made that decision, at least for 26, to continue to provide those services once the slots have been filled up, to open it up for those students that may not meet the income eligibility requirements, to consider them for a pre-K enrollment as well.
Thank you. Vice Chair Briggs.
Thank you so much, Chair Jackson, and thank you to the superintendent and Chief Howe for the presentation today. I had a few questions because I want to dig a little deeper into, I think, some, I don't want to say inconsistencies, but varying points of view on some of the, what was presented today in the slide. I want to start with just a really quick question for slide 15, where it talks about the federal impact aid. Chief Howe, can you just speak to why the interest in federal impact aid was excluded? I actually spoke to one of my charter leaders, and they said that was the first time that a charter has seen the language in a PGCPS budget presentation. Can you just clarify that issue?
Sure. So the guidance that we received is around the SPED overage. And the SPED overage specifically talked about the fact that that is a burden, that's a responsibility, that's an obligation that the district must cover from other revenue sources. So you look at those other revenue sources that you use to help cover that SPED overage, and those revenue sources are assigned to that SPED overage and not allocated to the schools. And so in looking at the SPED overage, which we calculate specifically relating to what's excluded from charters, we looked at our other unrestricted revenue sources, federal impact aid, interest income, as well as the transition grant. And when you look at the sum of that revenue, it doesn't even cover the cost of the SPED overage. And so as a district, we have to cover that SPED overage, and the guidance that we received is it's expected that that SPED overage will be used by those resources. So that's why we don't directly allocate it to charters.
Okay,
The other
Chief
way,
Howe,
does that make sense?
hate to interrupt you, and I would love for you to keep answering that. I did have one more question since I have 32 seconds left. Can you speak to the cost of charter facilities and overhead the charters cover? Where does that fit into the overall picture? Does that change the calculation of the minimum school funding minus facility cost? And I just want to say, for example, why did the budget presentation omit recognition of the significant combined facility and operational costs? It's about 25 to 30% over $3,500 per pupil that we're hearing charter schools are independently managing due to the lack of dedicated capital funding. Can you just speak overall to all the funding streams?
So I want to make sure I'm understanding what you're looking at, but I think generally I thought I heard a question around, do the charters receive additional funding to cover their facility costs?
No. So can you speak to the cost of charter facilities and the overhead that charters cover? Where does that fit into the overall picture? Does that change the calculation of the minimum school funding minus facility cost? And then can you speak to that 25 to 30%, which is about $3,500 per pupil, that charters are saying that they're footing the bill on?
So I want to make sure I'm clear. When you think about the revenue that comes into for charter schools, it includes all the blueprint revenue. We add to that their share of transportation revenue. We back out 2%, and they get everything else. Out of that 98% that they get of blueprint revenue, as well as their transportation revenue, that funding is intended to cover all of their instructional costs, their facility costs, their other administrative costs. So they receive, unlike our traditional schools, they receive all of the blueprint program revenue. They receive all of it except for 2%. And from there, they cover their costs.
Board Member Goins McCants.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, all for this presentation. This has been a lot of information, and I think is really helpful in terms of understanding what the information is that we're actually looking at when we're talking about the budget. I did have one question about the clarification when you said that you're trying to move some of the centrally managed positions from the central cost centers to our school cost centers. Can you explain for those of us who are not necessarily finance gurus like you are, what exactly does that mean by move them?
So that's a great question, and I'll give you an example. And it's centrally managed positions as well as we refer to discretionary costs as non-personnel costs. So it's everything else that's not tied to a position. But school nurses is a great example of a position that sits in a school cost center. It sits in a central office cost center, but obviously it's a school nurse. And it's set up in that way, and there's various reasons why, but that's just an example. We have other positions where it's not one-to-one, so that's an example. It's sitting in a central office cost center. So as that position is filled, you have an employee that's sitting in that position, the cost for that position, the budget for that position, it's being charged to a central office cost center. But it's supporting a school. So how do we get then that budget and those expenditures that is mandated by Blueprint? Because Blueprint says we don't want to see it sitting in a central office cost center. We want to see it sitting in a school level cost center. Well, that gives us the challenge of, do we move the position to a school cost center, which doesn't often work because it's not always a one-to-one allocation. You could have one position that's sitting in a central office that supports many schools. So you can't divvy it up. So, you have to, for Blueprint purposes, have to have that budget that's tied to that position sitting in a school cost center. So when we talk about moving those costs, what we are currently looking at is, the short and dirty answer is doing a journal entry, which is the accounting team, booking something in our system to move the budget for that position and to move the expenses for that position from a central office cost center to a school. Ideally, we'd like to get to a place where we could, through our system, through our ERP system, have that process automated, where there's a way in which it could look at the costs tied to these centrally managed positions or discretionary items and run an allocation that moves those costs on our behalf. But right now, it is a manual process in order to meet that mandate because the reporting by Blueprint will not look at a central office cost center. So we want to make sure, again, that we're demonstrating that we're meeting that requirement, and that's one of the challenges that we mentioned. It's not like we don't have school nurses, it's just not where Blueprint wants to be able to see those costs.
Got it. So will that at all impact how much money that principals have to allocate within their school-based budgets?
So that is one of the three pots that makes up their overall budget. So you've got the allocation pot, and that's what the principals have the discretion for. You've got the school-based locked positions, and then you've got the centrally managed. All those three components make up their total school budget. Right now, if you were to take a peek into our general ledger system, and you were to pull up, I'm going to use Lake Arbor Elementary. That's my favorite example for everything. Shout out to Lake Arbor. It's in my neighborhood school. But if I were to look at the budget for Lake Arbor Elementary, I would see my SBB budget, and I would see my school-based lock budget. I would not see my centrally managed budget. And
and I don't mean to cut you off because I'm sure you're going to give us a wonderful additional information. I just want to make sure that I'm clear because I don't see the timer moving. But would that at all change how much we are asking principals or the amount that we are giving principals or keeping from principals? Or would that literally just be a manual change on paper?
That does not impact the budget that the principals receive. Their SBB allocation remains unchanged. It will actually help their overall budget, but it does not take away from the SBB budget.
Got it. So that is a basic, for lack of a better word, an us problem in terms of accounting, not necessarily something that will impact what principals have to outline their budgets in their buildings and serve their students.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Board Member Boozer Struthers.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for the presentation. So I think, one, the work you are doing is really phenomenal and essential, and I know certainly will help us tell our story, explain how the dollars are spent in ways that we have always wanted to do. And I think, of course, Blueprint helped push that along, but I think your work is actually accelerating, that true cost centers to students and schools, such as riding on a bus, that we have not been counting as a student service. And I saw your budget presentation last night that really the calculations you've already come to, that 85% of the dollars are reaching the student into the school building. Like that the central office has really, I think, a smaller percentage than we even could understand until your work. So I want to bring last night's meeting and tonight's together. But my fear for us is the state laws and the change in per pupil allocations that SB 529 started this year to diminish for per pupil funding is going to impact every single school building. And if the Blueprint, our programs, and the escalation in funding is to match new expenses. So if we have to keep growing the program, but the legislature keeps cutting the per pupil allocation, we are now just cutting into these other sources. And so if you could speak to the reality of this great work you did for 26, but 27 and 28 to 32 are not looking so great. The first bill was $1 billion in cuts over those 8 years. So what do we do? And how's that impact your work?
That is a great question. There's a key aspect that I think got lost a little bit in the discussion when it came around to the Blueprint proposed cuts for 2025 or for 26, that didn't speak to the fact that foundation, which is supposed to be enough funding to cover the basics needed for every single student in every single school, is not enough. And so when there was this discussion around collaborative planning and putting that on pause on what that was going to mean, while we didn't necessarily have an issue with delaying collaborative planning from a resource standpoint, and we understand what that means to execute that, there's funding tied to that, and foundation already is not enough. Again, you look at a small school like Baden as an example. It's a teeny school. The bare minimum that they need to have enough teachers to have a reasonable class size is not fully covered, per se, by the current amount that's set aside just for foundation. You cut into that, whether it's this year or it's been delayed and paused, you still have a long-term problem with foundation not being set where it needs to be to cover not just the resources needed for teachers and educators and out-of-classroom positions, but the cost of technology and mental health supports and college and career readiness for those students who are not yet there. So there's another funding stream to support students who have met CCR, but we have work to do to get the students to meet CCR. That's also supposed to be covered in foundation. So it's really looking at the foundation amount and whether or not that amount is reasonable to where it needs to be to cover just the bare minimum for every single student. And you layer that on top of the programming that we are offering in our schools, which again isn't necessarily tied to the funding methodology for Blueprint. So it is a challenge. It is a challenge in how you're going to be able to kind of bridge that gap. So we got through this year, but the work is not over. It's going to get scarier as we get into 27 and beyond.
Board Member Olivio.
Thank you, Chair Jackson. Board Member Strother actually brought up the point I was going to make, but I'll just underscore it. My question was going to be on the preliminary minimum school funding. We need to get to 75%. In many cases, we're over that. I was going to ask about, as we look to really correctly allocate a lot of these central services, do you have confidence that we really, in reality, right now are above 75%? It sounds like that answer is yes, but I just wanted to underscore that.
When you consider all the school-based costs, including the centrally managed, we get to those minimum school funding percentages that you saw that were displayed earlier. That's on paper, right? That's in our Excel modeling. That's not in Oracle. We're not there yet. If you don't consider this centrally managed, and we've had this conversation, is the juice worth the squeeze? Like, what do we need to get to at least demonstrate 75%? it doesn't take away from the fact that we may still be spending the money, but what do we need to do to make sure it's in the cost center? But we still want to be able to tell our story. This is the only reporting mechanism that would really tell our story. So for me, the goal is to get every centrally managed cost that is tied to supporting a school in a school cost center, because I want that story to be told. I don't want it to keep getting blurred by sitting in a central office cost center. So based off of what's on paper in our Excel model, we feel pretty confident about where we are, and that really fed into making our resource reallocation decisions, knowing that we had to take away from some to get the others, knowing that we don't have this centrally managed in our system right now, but in order to make those informed decisions, what does it look like if we were to consider those costs? So we feel pretty good about what we've modeled out. Again, the challenge is how do we actually actualize or operationalize that major component, which I said is like $500 million, so it's a lot of money, it's not insignificant. How do we get that reflected and get credit for it to help tell our story of what we're doing here in PGCPS?
Thank you. Dr. Anderful?
Thank you. I actually wanted to circle back to two questions that other board members proposed, as they were similar to ones that I had, and I wanted to make sure that I was clear on the response that was provided. So the first one was specifically about the PPA and just what we're seeing in terms of the actual allocations for traditional schools and charter schools. And so I think what was shared is that when we look at the overall funding that charters receive, that it is true that the amount that they receive, they're expected to actually ensure that the cost of facilities and any other costs that they need to incur come out of that amount that is provided. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and so if we look at it just on its face, then once they've covered the cost of additional fees, then essentially they are having less funds than to, actually support their other needs for students and the school more broadly, correct?
Well, I can only speak to the funding that comes from the district. The charters, and I can't speak to all of them, they know their financials better than we do. We are a primary funding source, but we're not their only funding source. They also have other sources of funds, whether it's fundraising, et cetera, to help cover the overall cost of that charter school. So I don't want it to be misrepresented that all they have is the $14,000 or whatever the number was on average per pupil, that that's all that they get. They do have other funding sources, and each charter, their story is varied and different. But that is a major component of the funding that comes from the district.
Okay, and I know I'm running out of time, but is that the same situation for our traditional schools as well?
As far as, well, our traditional schools, we don't do fundraising as a district, so our only funding source that we get is what I've outlined earlier, the funding we get for Blueprint, as well as any other ancillary revenue, interest income, et cetera, to cover everything for the district.
Okay, I know I'm running out of time, so I will come back for the next round. Thank you. Okay, so then I think what I'd like to follow up here on then, so there are some clear differences, and I just want to be clear too, what I'm not trying to do here is, kind of make it a traditional versus charter conversation. That's not what I'm trying to do here, to be clear. I'm just trying to make sure that I understand the differences and that the public is also aware of the differences. And so I'm sure we are all really wanting to ensure that we are providing equitable funding, and so I want to make sure that it's clear and plainly stated for everyone in the room, including for myself as a parent myself. So I think what will be helpful as well is, obviously we just spoke to, and Board Member Boozer-Strother spoke to just some of what we are experiencing as it relates to the new Blueprint formula. Can you just share, just based on past years, what specific changes we are seeing as it relates to either PPA or any other specific funding allocation that may be really just resulting in some of what we're seeing in terms of the decreases that some schools are experiencing with regards to funds? Is there anything you can speak to, so over years past, and maybe I can state it more plainly, are our charter schools specifically, or are there specific school types that are receiving significantly less funds this year than they have in years past?
The short answer to that is yes. Some schools are receiving less funding, and some schools are receiving more funding, and that's because the methodology is different. We experience that with our traditional schools, where some schools are like, wow, our budget has grown, this is great, we have the resources that we need. Other schools are like, ouch, my budget has been cut. What am I going to do? So that is a push and pull that we certainly had with our traditional schools. And I'm sure we've had that same experience with our charters as well. On average, when I think about the PPA that we had prior to the implementation of Blueprint for charters, it was around 14,100 or so. So when you look at the PPA amounts that were outlined on slide 13, you see for the charters, the low end, as low as 12,580, on the high end, as high as 15,720. So some of our charters are getting more funding this year than they did last year, than they did in 2024 as well. And some are receiving less. That's the funding methodology that's tied to Blueprint, but it's the same thing for our traditional schools as well. Some are feeling it, and they're figuring out how to rebalance their budget with the advent of Blueprint and what that actually means and what that looks like. I do also want to point out that the funding for charters is also very different depending on the charter school. As we have new charters that come into play, we are also forward funding those charters until they get to their enrollment growth that's expected for that overall school. So as that we have new schools coming on board, their funding is tied to the projected enrollment for the coming year, even though those students may not have been there. So if we have a new school, that's a new charter that's into the district, they have to have funding to get started, even if they had no students the year before. So there is that investment that is made as well.
Thank you. Before we go to our second round, I did just have a statement more so. I wanted to ask Dr. Moss actually to read the stat that was in regard to the state's leadership pay versus the teachers' pay and where we rank comparable to our counterparts in the state.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Jackson. So according to MSDE, we rank number 2 in the state for leadership pay, and we rank number 12 in the state for teacher pay. And that's starting salary.
Yeah. That's a terrible optic. And there's an old adage that says, you put your money where your heart is. And I surely know that that's not the case for PGCPS, but it's kind of hard to argue against it. We have to find a way to change that dynamic for sure, because our teachers deserve to live and work in the same place like everybody else. Thank you. Second round. I guess back to Dr. Moss.
Appreciate you. Chair Jackson, one of the things that I do want to say, even as it relates to that prior comment, is that, you know, MSF says that we need to be at 75%. I think the quickest way to get there is to make a conscious choice to invest in cost of living adjustments. If you invest in cost of living adjustments, you actually get yourself to 75% much quicker at the school level. And so I just want to lay that out versus centrally managed services. I do want to ask you all to go on a journey with me, though. Tell me what centrally managed services are for the general public. Are they required? Can you answer those two questions? So can we just name very quickly what is a centrally managed service, and is it required for charters to participate in centrally managed services?
So we're not deducting centrally managed services from charters. So when I'm speaking of centrally managed services, centrally managed locked, and I want to make sure I'm very clear because I don't want it to get confused with centrally managed services that's referenced in the charter allocation or charter calculation. So are you specifically asking around centrally managed services? That's part of the charter school methodology. Are you asking about centrally managed locked as a resource type that helps to support budgets for all of our schools.
I'm talking
including-
about the former rather than the latter.
I'm sorry, I missed that
The
part.
former rather than latter. So the first explanation, I'm talking about centrally managed services as it relates to charter schools.
Yes.
Is it a la carte? Yeah.
Yes, so centrally managed services for charters, we provide these services on their behalf, and they have the option, if they want to be able to buy them back, but we're providing those services regardless. And I'll give you an example. They're outlined on slide 20.
And can I ask you one other question? When you say buy them back, what do you mean?
So the charter allocation that they receive, it includes 98% of the funding that comes in the door. We withhold 2%. So if we go through negotiations and we haven't gone through that process yet, they have the ability to take part of that 98% and buy back a centrally managed service. And I'll give you an example, and this hasn't been negotiated, hasn't been discussed. But induction coaches, as an example, there's a COMAR requirement that says our new educators are required to have an induction coach, a mentor teacher in their early years. Right now, those services are provided by PGCPS on behalf of all of our schools, all of our teachers. We don't deduct that from the charter allocation. Is that something they should buy back and pay for? Perhaps, but that hasn't been negotiated. So they receive that full 98%. But if we go through negotiations that it's mutually agreed upon that they should pay for that, they would buy back the service of that induction coach expense.
So I appreciate you explaining that. So a centrally managed service is really additive. Does the same buyback notion apply to traditional public schools where they can buy a centrally managed service, or is it truly additive and there's no buyback component for the traditional public school?
So I want to make sure that distinguishing between the way in which the charters and the traditionals are funded. So these centrally managed services are provided for all of our students, all of our schools, if it applies. It is part of the total school budget, So for our traditional schools, they have their SBB allocation, they have their centrally managed locked, and then they have their centrally managed, they have their school-based locked, and then they have their centrally managed locked. So those centrally managed locked are part of their total budget for that school. The same thing applies to charters. They have their charter allocation, which is that 98% that I spoke of. On top of that, when we're looking at their total budget, we add the cost or the budget of the school-based locked, which are their special education resources. And then we have the centrally managed locked that's added on top of that to equal the total budget for that charter school. That doesn't mean total cash that they receive, because again, those services are provided on their behalf, but their allocation that they get is it's one of the three components that makes up the total budget for that school.
Yeah, I want to wrap up my question here. I far exceeded my time. I do want to make the case that one of the restricted items is Title II and professional learning. And that is a restricted item that's restricted by the federal law. The only way a charter can access title dollars for professional development would be by participating in that professional development. They wouldn't be able to get straight title dollars for professional development on their own. And so the reason why I asked my question around centrally managed services, it seems to be that the cart doesn't include everything, and it's subjective in certain narratives, particularly with respect to title and professional learning. So a charter school couldn't access the restricted funding as it relates to professional development on their own. We don't just allocate that dollar to them. What we do is say, if you're going to participate in that pot of money, you would have to participate in our professional development. So in one way, I'm curious if is there anything that restricts us from allocating title dollars directly to charters rather than expecting them to participate in professional learning, which in essence would increase the percentage of money that they're actually getting to their schools if we were allocating title dollars, which are restricted in nature. But is there anything precluding us from taking that item and actually giving that money to charters?
For our centrally managed entitlement grants, for all of them, Title II, III, et cetera, They are all centrally managed, and none of that funding is distributed to any of our schools.
I think I
And so,
understand
and so
that.
with regards to your question, whether or not we have the ability to do that, that's something that legally we would have to consider further. As a practice, the district has never done that. And I don't know if there's a legal requirement that says we can or we cannot, but we've always managed those entitlement grants centrally, and we include and provide those resources or access to those resources for all of our schools, including our charters. If you have specific questions around what that looks like, I mean, I'd have to defer to the teams that actually administer those grants, but that's how we manage it for all of our schools. We don't distribute the funds to individual principals at our traditional schools either. But I understand the basis of your question. But, I mean, that's something we could certainly explore to find out if there's a legal restriction around that, but that's not something the district has done as a practice.
Okay, thank you so much. Moving forward, Dr. Anderful.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to, as I mentioned, come back to a previous question as well. And I want to make sure I'm getting this correctly because I know we're talking about school-based locked, we're talking about centrally based locked, all these different locked pots of money. The assistant principal locked position that is new this year. We discussed this in our last board meeting, and I just wanted to make sure that I was clear, again, also for the public and for a few schools that I appreciate I can't remember who shared it with us, the list of schools that actually would not like to have an assistant principal. There was a small number, but still a number of schools, however, who were not interested in having an assistant principal. And my understanding now is that that specific money, I think as Board Member Goins-McCant was asking and questioning, is not something that will impact the school's actual budget, right? So if a school were to have this new assistant principal, which is now a locked 12-month position, it would not have any direct impact on the funds or the budget of that school. However, if a school is saying that they do not want the assistant principal, I'm just confirming, they cannot use that money for any other purpose. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And why is that?
A decision was made as a district to provide those resources on a consistent basis across all of our schools. Based off of the needs of what those schools in aggregate, what we felt was best to support those schools. I'll certainly defer to my fellow colleague to maybe provide a little bit more clarity around the why around that decision, but I know it's something that came up in some of our conversations that we had with our labor partners around that resource being locked in that way. And so, perhaps it's something that, she might be able to provide a little bit more clarity around some of those discussions that were held.
Good evening. I don't want to take away too much of the time. So, okay. Just going back to your question about that was a decision that we made that all schools would have a locked 12-month position. We did collaborate with the union on that because also in their negotiated agreement, we were already providing 2 weeks coverage for principals in the month of July because our current assistant principals, they were not working in the month of July. So you really had no one if a principal wanted to take some leave to cover them. So this also helps to address that and ensuring that we have 2 administrators that are leading our schools all year long.
Thank you. So I understand that, and I think that was explained in the last meeting. What I'm trying to understand, the reason I asked why is because, again, there are a small number of schools, and I'm acknowledging a small number of schools, and I appreciate you all sharing the list of schools that in fact do not want an assistant principal. Those funds, right, for that 12-month paid position cannot be used by those schools for any other purpose. And Chief Howell said they cannot because it was a decision that was made. So that decision was solely made by the district, and those funds cannot be used for any other purpose, period, is what you're saying.
That is correct, but I do want to add to that, as we went through the school budgeting process, again, school by school, and looking at what each school needs. So realizing that they're receiving a locked assistant principal 12-month, what kind of impact, if any, does that have to that school, and what do they need to support their programming for the coming year? So if in those conversations with the principal and their instructional director and their associate superintendent, if the hand was raised and there was discussion around, hey, this funding used to be out of my SBB allocation and now it's been locked and removed to provide for an AP that maybe is not the most critical need that they have, but these are the other critical needs that I do have, how can I be supported? During those conversations, resource allocations or reallocations may have been made to make sure those needs were being met. So while they may not be able to do something else with those resources tied to that AP, did not mean that that school, if they had a need, did not receive the additional funding that was needed to support those critical needs in that building.
Okay, I know my time is up, but I'm just going to say this one last thing, and then I'm going to turn my mic off. Don't bite my head off, Chair Jackson. So I understand that. I think what I'm trying to also, let me give us a very specific example, and then I'm going to turn my mic off. If a school is saying they do not want an assistant principal, there were funds that are actually available for them to have an assistant principal, but that school is now facing, perhaps due to the blueprint formula or other budget cuts, they are facing having to actually cut positions within their schools, lose actual teachers, lose instructional support, but they actually could have funds, right, that were being provided for an assistant principal. I hear you saying that you assess what the school need, but to me, that also sounds like a need. So my question is, have you actually really talked directly to schools and considered that on a case-by-case basis? Because if so, it seems to me that schools would not be in a position where they're having to cut teachers and instructional support.
Well,
And I can't answer that based upon the last conversation. We did go to those principals to talk about what was their need and what they felt that adding this additional would take. And so they did work with their instructional directors to look at what it was that they need so that they could also have this resource.
Board Member
I mean,
Boozer.
that's consistent with what, I was going to just say. As I mentioned earlier, Dr. Amelia Coleman is here as well. These were not decisions that were made in a vacuum by finance. These decisions were made in collaboration with the principals, communicating directly with their instructional directors, and then having those conversations as well with the associate superintendents. So those decisions were made at the school, by the school leadership in conjunction with them, to really balance out what was needed. So, I mean, it was a collaborative process to get to that point.
Thank you. Board Member Boozer Struthers.
Thank you so much. Superintendent House, I think you may be answering these questions, and you could share my mic or borrow another mic. But, I think, the interesting questions around charter schools, and of course, I mean, there's a lot of information readily available about the Maryland's charter school law and the agreements of what is vast majority are nonprofit charter organizations that do operate with, you could review their 990s and have significant fund balances because of the reality of running nonprofits. So Superintendent House, is any charter required to be a charter in Prince George's County, or is this a choice?
It's a great question. I think it's probably a legal question. What I do know about the charter law, quite frankly, in Maryland, as you indicated, they have the opportunity to have multiple sources of whether it's charter growth fund, whether it's philanthropic dollars, but in terms of the LEA that they go to be that charter and to come under that LEA. I don't know that it's required. I think it's something that has to be looked at legislatively. I think it's a voice, quite frankly, that charters will need to take a close look at. And be in Annapolis, to have those conversations, to really push the envelope around what they can and can't do. In many other states, charters have the ability to come under LEAs, not only as school districts, but also universities and other organizations. So that may be a point of reference in terms of legislative lobbying for the future, given that charters have kind of come together, which is a good thing. It might be an opportunity to come together legislatively to take a close look at what can change if there are situations where they want additional change in reference to LEAs.
Yeah, definitely appreciate that, because I think maybe the amount of time has passed since these original Maryland founding rules, that charters are, the special organization that comes to any district that allows charters to choose to be part of the district. And may I have just a little more time?
Yeah.
That, as a parent and advocate involved in traditional, boundary schools where my son is being educated, the pain points of this chronic underfunding for decades and decades is very old, dilapidated buildings. We fight every year for full amount of funding for our buildings. We fight every year for adequate funding for our children. And, that fight is hard as well. We do not have PTAs that are equivalent to, say, the charter operators' balance, right? But those balances are very important. They fund the facilities, they fund staff development, they fund the curriculum resources. It's an agreement. It's a choice. It's an agreement. It's a different way of operating. So, in some ways, I'd say, join the full fight in Annapolis, but it is very painful, and it, to some extent, I would say around the facilities, you may be happy with your funding situation, because the lack of control, if you listen to last night's budget meeting, we had enough funding for 55 summer projects. I've been on this board where we've had well over 100 summer facility projects, and that's Annapolis, and that's your county council. So join in, let's all work together, but I do think the charters go back to Annapolis and really, really look at this so that we could all, be one PGCPS together. Thank you.
Thank you.
The extra time.
No problem. Vice Chair.
Okay, thank you so much, Chair Jackson. So, Chief Howell, I want to just go way back to the question that I had earlier. But I really want to emphasize, I think, a bigger point, which is that throughout this discussion about charters and our partnership with all of our schools in the district, and to be clear, not to make a distinction between traditionals and charter schools, and that there's some competition, because all of our students need to be college and career ready and ready for post-secondary success, or whatever that may look like for them. But I want to be clear that I think for me, something that I'm really feeling very concerned about is that it doesn't seem like there's a deep collaboration with our charters. And I think I mentioned that because I want to highlight your comment about there's other funding streams that charters deal with that you're not aware of. And I don't think that's for lack of trying. I know you work really hard, because I've seen you over the last 2.5 years do that. But I think it's really essential that we understand that our charter schools are serving all of our students, and it's really important that the people in our district office understand where that funding is going and how much they have. I mean, what I continue to hear is that this is an existential crisis for our charter schools, and that means for our students. I did want to go to the mentioned slide 8 and 19, because you all talked about specialty schools as a district initiative, but nowhere did it mention the cost of specialty schools. So what is the cost for the Academy of Health Sciences, for Visual and Performing Arts, for Science and Technology, for dual language programs? It did not discuss that at all, nor the impact. And so I'm just wondering about the minimum school funding percentage for those schools. Can you speak to that just really quickly?
That is something that we can get back to you. if you're looking to understand the cost of our different specialty programs, we have a lot of specialty programs across the district, and the funding for that is varied, and so it's not a short, easy answer. Dr. White may have something that she can kind of pull together that kind of summarizes what that looks like, but that's certainly something we could provide.
Okay, thank you, Chief Howell. And then I just want to be clear, I think this presentation was well done. I think that you provided a lot of, clear information. I do think the picture is murky when it comes to the charters, because we talk about the 98% and the 2%, and then we say that they are in aggregate at 107%. But then there's this whole pot of money that we know they're not getting direct dollars for, Title II, Title III funds, the county contribution that wasn't mentioned. And so it's just really important, I think, for people to kind of trek all the way down from wherever they came from, whether it's Southern County or Northern County, to where we are today to hear the presentation. I think everyone here deserves the clear facts about what it is that our schools are being faced with. And again, I want to be clear that I'm not saying that in opposition to you all. I know that everyone cares deeply about our students, but I do think that when we hear as board members that charter schools are saying something is contradictory to what you all are presenting, this is where I think this is feedback. I think this is where things get confusing, and we go back and we're like, wait, 107%, but you're saying that, so they're fully staffed. We have specialty programs. We have students with special education needs. This is really serious, and I think the more I'm thinking about it, the more frustrated I feel, because I don't think that I got full answers here. I'm not frustrated at anyone here, but I'm frustrated about the fact that this process wasn't 100% clear, and I'm just hoping that we can use this as information and say this is serious stuff. We can't get this time back for our students and their families, and I hope that when we think about how we present data, let's make sure that we understand the full picture of what everyone is saying, so that we can clearly communicate what's happening versus, I think, maybe some parts here that are slightly misleading, i.e. the 107%, and other factors. So I just wanted to give that feedback to you. Also, can you speak to the county contribution piece, the fund balance, Title II, Title III funds that weren't necessarily mentioned in here as it pertains to charter schools?
Yeah, so I'll start off with the county contribution. So all the Blueprint funding that we receive, there is a state share and there's a local or a county share. So all of the minimum school funding, all the Blueprint funding programs that we discussed earlier, that is including the county contribution. We don't receive anything above and beyond the local share from the county. Now, we have not received our transmitted budget for this year. Perhaps there might be additional funding that we get above and beyond that local share, but that's it. So the charters are getting their fair share of that dollar from state and county. So it does include that. And then as it relates to the entitlement grants, as I said, we can have further discussion around, or we can look further into, are there legal restrictions that keeps us from allocating those funds directly to a charter school? So that's certainly something that we could look into. I don't have the answer to that, but that's certainly something that we can look into. I will caution, as I said earlier, though, however, a lot of the federal funding for 26 is being reduced or cut. So it won't be there for next year. But just in terms of clarity, whether it's $1 or $1 million that we do get, we want to understand what we are legally required to do and what we can and cannot do with how those resources are allocated. Fund balance, charters have their own fund balance. So whatever funding that we give to them that they don't spend, we don't ask for that back. Some LEAs do. They require those funds to be returned. So if they don't spend the money, it falls to their fund balance, and they have access to those resources.
Thank you. Board Member Gordon McKenzie.
Thank you, Chair. I have a couple of questions that I know might not be able to fully be answered tonight, but towards Board Member Dr. Anderfull, some of her questions about our buildings specifically, some of the bigger things that expenses that some of our schools have, our charters versus our traditional public schools. Do we cover any of their building costs at all? Like, is that negotiated in the contracts? Is that like included at all? Basically, the things that are included in our capital improvement budget, are those included at all for charters?
No, the capital improvement budget is separate from our operating budget, and those resources are not allocated to the charters.
Got it. So do all of our charters own all of their own buildings? Are they renting from us? Where do those buildings come from?
Currently, right now, we have one charter, I believe, that's sitting in one of our buildings, but most of them have their own facilities. But in the past, we have had charters that use our buildings, and we negotiate the rent that they pay for those buildings. I think we have one currently right now that's in one of our PGCPS buildings.
And I know I've been told repeatedly that Maryland has different laws around this than other states. So, excuse me, but is that normal in terms of how schools, our charter schools explicitly, are given their funding?
My experience is Maryland, but maybe Superintendent House has an insight, or others who have experience with charters outside of the state of Maryland. I'm looking at the charter office, maybe they do, but in the state of Maryland, that's how we capture that here. But I don't know if Javon Hall has any insight for other states.
It can be done different ways, but for the most part, what is consistent is that charters are responsible for their own facility cost. Now, that can be done differently. Some of that can be, as indicated before, specifically working in conjunction, negotiation with the district for a facility. But for the most part, whether it's rental cost or going out for a commercial mortgage, it can be done several different ways, specifically in the state of Maryland.
And then to circle back to Vice Chair Briggs' question about our specialty schools, outside of our buildings, if there is a deficit in a specialty program, do we as a district cover that? Like if SBB doesn't specifically cover all of their needs, do we cover that?
The short answer is funding that is not, when you think about the dollars that come in for a school, they cover the cost of their school and they meet their minimum, whatever the minimum school funding percentage is. Let's say it's, 80%. There's another 20% that remains out of that dollar that comes. Part of those costs, part of that revenue is used to cover central services, but part of those costs could be used to allocate to another school. Very different from charters, because each charter gets their own budget. So there is no sharing of the pot of money that comes in for those schools collectively. So as a district,
Got it.
we
I know I'm a
reallocate
little
these-
bit over time, and I don't mean to just completely cut you off, but I guess what I'm asking specifically is if we look at SBB, and I'll use our neighboring district for example, we have some schools that have very expensive specialty programs, and we would not be able to cover that just with SBB funds, but they get additional monies from somewhere. Do we also do that in Prince George's County?
It's all coming from our blueprint revenue that comes into the district. So it's coming from the same funding source. It's following the student to the school, and to the extent that there's funding that remains that comes into the district for a school, and we've met that minimum school funding percentage for that school, those resources can be reallocated to another school within the district to help cover what they may need, whether it's a specialty program, whether it's a CSI school, whether it's other funding shortfalls, but we have that flexibility to reallocate resources from one school to the next, but it's all coming from the blueprint revenue that comes into the school. As long as we've met that minimum school funding percentage requirement, then we have the ability to use that remainder to cover central office services, obviously, and then, certainly cover needs for other schools as well.
That completes your question, Board Member McKenzie. You're good. All right, thank you so much. It's hard being a chair because you always go last and all of the great questions already asked. But I did want to circle back about the different funding revenue streams. My question is, you mentioned that some federal funding will be cut. Can you talk about some of the federal funding be cut?
So based off of some of the preliminary information that we've received, Title II, Title III, and Title IV will be cut or eliminated altogether. Student with disabilities, there's been no action on that. And then Title I funding, we don't know, but that has also we've been informed that it's going to be lower than it has been in the past. Not completely eliminated, but it will be reduced funding as well.
I think that the budget that Congress is proposing right now doesn't have any cuts to Title I, if I'm not mistaken.
That's not the guidance we've received at this point. If that ends up being the case and we don't have the final allocation, we will be able to go back and reevaluate our budget. But right now, based off of the guidance that we received as a state and the guidance that we then took from the state, we reflected a reduction of 20% in our Title I funding and how it's been allocated to the schools. But once we receive that final allocation, we can make adjustments accordingly.
Thank you so much. Moving on to the consent agenda. There's no consent agenda today. Unfinished business, none. General orders, none. So new business, is there any new business? Okay, seeing no hands. I just want to, thank my board members for coming out today and showing up. We wanted to bring this meeting to the community because a lot of people requested a lot of information as it pertains to funding, and we wanted to make sure we were available to answer the questions. And thank you, Superintendent House and the staff for coming and giving us a presentation on how funding is allocated. Hopefully we were able to answer a lot of the questions that you all had. That was our goal tonight. And if there's no other comments, Ms. Lopez, please call the roll.
Chair Jackson, this is Dan.
To adjourn?
To adjourn.
Yep, okay. All righty. Without objection, meeting is adjourned.